Okay, this is Marty Wilson speaking. It's December 11th, 2024. I'm sitting here with Dr. Damary Bonilla-Rodriguez. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
And we're here to talk about, you've been active in social things in the county, and as you said a second ago, not just in Monroe County, Pike County. But let's start at the beginning. Where and when were you born?
I was born and raised in New York City, in East Harlem, New York. We call it El Barrio. And so I identify as Nuyorican, which people, when they hear the term, think it's a made-up term, but it's actually a New York-born Puerto Rican. And there's a place in New York City called the Nuyorican Poets Cafe that focused on the culture of New York-born Puerto Ricans.
So you grew up and went to school and
everything in New York. Actually, I went to college and graduate school in New York as well. But I grew up coming to Monroe County as a child because my aunt and uncle had a trailer at the Outdoor World in Scott Run. And so all of my cousins, siblings, family members, we would come for weekends and holidays. And even some of my cousins that live across the country, even now will still reminisce. Remember when we grew up at camp? And so many of the staples, like the Pocono Cheesecake Factory and the Casino Theater, which just recently closed down, were part of my childhood.
I'm sorry, we didn't get what year. I mean, I'm not asking your age, but so we have an idea of the context of when you were coming to the Poconos. What years were we talking about?
Well, I can tell you my age, and I'm 45. So I grew up coming from elementary school, middle school, high school, and then...
I'm not good at the math. You're born in the 70s?
79, yeah. So the 80s, 90s. Okay. And then when I got to high school, my youth group would come to the then Fernwoods to go camping with different churches. So all the churches would come together at the Fernwoods and camp. And then as I got older, my husband and I would come. And one year he said, we should move over here. And I was like, we should move to camp? He goes, it's not camp, people live here. We love the flea market on 209 in Marshall's Creek and just coming to the area, enjoying nature. And it took about a year before I was like, you know what? Yeah, why not? So we bought property in Saw Creek Estates and we built the house and we moved. And we didn't have kids then. So we weren't looking for necessarily the schools or anything like that. It was more about recreating the childhood because he also would come as a child with his family and had some family that had a second home in Mount Pocono. So.
Most of the people I talked to, as we said a minute ago, were born here and they grew up here. But you were born somewhere else and started coming here sort of as a tourist.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your impressions were of the Poconos. I mean, you mentioned how'd you put it, staples, the Cheesecake Factory to a local, that's something that somebody from outside the Poconos, I think, would latch on to as characteristic of the Poconos.
Right.
So I'm curious about your impression of the Poconos.
It definitely wasn't what I know now as a resident, to your point, right? So I didn't visit the Pocono Culture and Cinema, right? Which now I'm a member of. My family has a membership. I didn't hike the Raymond's Gill Falls, which still is touristy, if you will, but I live near there now, so it's a walk. Or my boys going to McDade Trail as part of the Boy Scouts. That wasn't what we were doing. We were going to those tourist areas like the flea market, which at the time was huge. Now and throughout the recent years, it's been cut down. There's the Price Chopper supermarket and all of these other businesses that were there. So it's been interesting to come as a tourist and become a resident and a taxpayer and a homeowner in the area and see the transformation. So one year when we went to camp at Timothy Lake in Bushkill, which is where I live now, we forgot toothpaste and we couldn't figure out how do we get toothpaste without going all the way to Walmart in East Stroudsburg. And we bought it at Country Squire, which is the closest grocery store to me. And for years, up till recently, a few years back when they put the Turkey Hill down the road on the corner, that's the place where we would get ice and milk and, last minute things. So I think we paid like $5 for a little tube of toothpaste. And we never forgot it because they're like, don't ever forget the toothpaste. When I was 16 and we were driving from Scott Run to Timothy Lake, because that's part of the Outdoor World family. It's like the villas. Like, so those were our villas then. You know, you have those timeshares. My uncle asked if I wanted to drive up to Timothy Lake from Route 209. And I was like, oh, no, I don't want to drive up that mountain. It seemed daunting to me. But now Timothy Lake is halfway up the mountain to my house. So to drive up to the front gate in my community, I have to go past Timothy Lake. And now it's, you know, it's my norm. So it is fun to reminisce and think about, oh, I remember that time I didn't do, you know, I didn't drive this way or I didn't do that. Or going to different places and thinking, oh, I don't remember doing this when I was a kid. So if we would come for the 4th of July or anytime there were fireworks, we would go watch those at Camelback. But we never came as far as Shawnee because it was late at night and we wouldn't have been this far out at night. We would only come in the day. So just little experiences that now, as a person who lives here, you know, I try to make sense of them. But now my kids are growing up here. So now when they go to New York City, they have that tourist experience that I had here. So that's kind of fun.
This always fascinated me. Why did you choose to buy a house or land in a gated community like Salt Creek? I mean, why, if you're moving to the Poconos, did you ever consider just going to Stroudsburg and seeing if there's a house for sale?
No, because I grew up on the 13th floor of the projects in New York City. I always lived in a building. So I was always surrounded by lots of other families. And just the thought of being out in the open without what felt familiar to me was not comfortable. And so being in a gated community for me made me feel in community. And it's interesting, throughout the years, my husband and I have gone back and forth about, was it the best decision? You know, was it not? Because there are lots of regulations, right? We can't have a pool in our community. We have the property for it, but we can't because there are lots of pools there. And so we'll go back and forth, but I still feel better that I was in a gated community that I felt gave me that sense already, because it was a new place. Although some of it was familiar, as we discussed, it was a new place. I couldn't go to the grocery store and recognize people like I did at home.
So for a sense of security.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, for sure. And, you know, there's this, my aunt always says, you know, all the fugitives end up in Pennsylvania, in the forest, in the trees by you, you know, and we laugh about it. But I think that when she says that, that's the feeling that you have. Like, I'm safe because I'm in this community. You know, and there's some open communities that maybe would have given that impression as well. We had friends that were building in Salt Creek and took us to see it at the time that we were looking. And I do remember that part standing out to me. I was like, you know what, this is good. The other thing is, I think when you live in buildings, and particularly I grew up in New York City Housing Authority, and there's a level of conditioning that happens when you live in places that have, you know, these systemic guidelines, if you will. And so one thing I kept thinking about was, I know everybody gets annoyed about the rules in these communities, but I feel they're consistent. So if I can't do it, nobody else can either. So there's a level of consistency. I think knowing that we were going to be far from family, you know, we didn't have a lot of examples around us of people who had owned homes, and definitely nobody in our immediate families or close families had built a house. There were a lot of unknowns, and so at least certain things we would know by being in a community, which was, you know, the security piece, the knowing that there were some people that we could reach out to because we were within this kind of close space. Even looking at lots, that came into play for me. Like, I was like, I want space, but I don't want to be too far from others. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be able to see a house. And we kind of went back and forth with that. Over the years, I've gotten used to the space. Now, I should have gone, you know, a bit further from people, but I still like that too. So it's been an interesting dynamic, and now we're here almost 18 years and still think about those things sometimes.
What were some of the hardest things to get used to moving up here?
Well,
you mentioned the toothpaste, right?
Yeah, the access, definitely. New York City, you walk everywhere. And there are times, not as much now, but in the first almost decade, there were times that I would drive into the city for the day, obviously visit family, but get things that I couldn't get here, right? Certain cultural foods that now we can get, products. I would get my hair done and my nails done because there was a sense of comfort, and I could get there. If I'd gone further, I couldn't have, but knowing I could. And I would park the car and walk all day, like just all day. And I had access to everything. I could go to the cleaners, the bodega, just everywhere. The access was difficult here because you have to drive everywhere. And again, you don't see people. Now everywhere I go, I know people, but you didn't see people. One of my first friends was the assistant director of our gated community. And actually we were texting just 2 nights ago about a couple of things, and just, kind of going back and forth and saying like, we're glad to have each other. And I said, thank you again for welcoming us with open arms. You were one of our first friends. And she's like, I do it all over again. It was just nice to have that person to ask questions and, go back to, and that we were able to build a friendship over the years. So I would say definitely access. The quietness was an adjustment. And it's interesting, but that's one of the factors that my kids have mentioned when they visit New York City for the night. And so they like the hustle and bustle temporarily. And they'll say, can we go back to our quiet house? Mm-hmm. But for me, it was the opposite. I was so used to, I lived by the East River, right along the FDR Drive. I could look out the living room window and see the traffic. And I was so used to that. The stillness and the quietness of the Poconos was not an easy adjustment. It had been great when we were camping for the weekend or the week, but it forces you to be still for a bit. And then we kept reminding ourselves, my husband and I, because we didn't have kids at the time, this is why we moved here, right? We wanted to have the American dream, if you will, right? The home ownership, but also we wanted space and privacy and nature. And we commuted. So after we got a handle on that, when we would get into the S's right before we crossed the toll, we both would kind of look and like, we knew what that meant. Like, we're home, right? We just feel good. Like, it's calm, we're home. So it didn't matter if we had a crazy day, it didn't matter if we had traffic. Once we got to the S's, we're home. And we got used to that. So now with our kids, like, it's too loud going somewhere else. And they really love what we moved here for, which was nature and the outdoors and, all of what we see. And the work that I've been able to do in so many ways is to protect that. So I served on the board of the Brodhead Watershed Association for 6 years. Environmental justice is not a topic that was discussed in New York City Housing Authority and in the city or, in the projects. My grandparents raised me. They went to the 1st and the 3rd grade. Environmental justice wasn't their first issue, right? It wasn't important. The most important thing to them, they probably didn't even know enough to discuss it. And so here is where I learned, how do we leverage advocacy and our voice to protect the environment, to protect our waters, and, which then translates to a lot of social justice conversations like Flint, Michigan, and, how do we allow opportunity for everyone to access clean air and water. Those are things you don't think about on the front end. But over time, as you settle in and start appreciating it, you realize this is really big. It's a big deal.
Well, we ought to talk about your training maybe a little bit so that people know, and then when you get into your career later, it'll make more sense.
Yeah.
So you say your grandparents raised you for the first...
My whole life, yeah.
Oh, your whole life?
Yeah.
And you went to public school, and where'd you go to college?
I went to the College of New Rochelle, which is in Westchester, New York. And then for undergrad and graduate school, and then my doctorate is from St. John Fisher College, which is in Rochester, New York. So everything in terms of my education was based in New York. And so my grandparents raised me my whole life because I was born to a teen mom who came home to live with them when I was born. And then as she established herself, there are these cultural aspects that for women, especially in the Latino culture, you don't get to decide certain things, right? This was the experience that I saw. Definitely not the same in my own life. I was doing a coaching session right before I came here with a professional Latina, and I was saying we have a choice. But when my mother was growing up, it didn't feel like a choice. So when she moved out, she wasn't allowed to take me with her. And that happened a lot. You know, I have family members my age and older than me where if you were raised with your grandparents and your parent left, they left. Like they're starting a life, but this is your life. So
how old were you when she moved out?
I was one because she had met my stepdad and she was working and they moved in together. And I was with my grandparents. So that was an interesting dynamic.
This is a Latino cultural thing.
Yeah. And it's not for everybody, but there were just so many situations around, and it's changed a bit, but around domestic violence, and for women, especially if you were a single mother, if you were not working or pursuing a career or some sort of independence, which wasn't encouraged on the front end anyway, there was a level of dependency on the parents and the family, right? That's how everything stayed close-knit. And so my mom graduated high school, so all of her work was always customer service. You know, she was a cashier when she was younger at the local hardware store. That's where she met my stepdad. She was a school bus driver eventually because she did get her license. But many women in the Latino culture throughout the years did not get to spread their wings, as we say, you know, in the American culture. They were conditioned to, what are the family's needs? You attend to the family's needs. You know, there are men, for example, brothers, uncles, who need support in order to go out and work. Right? Their job is to work, your job is to take care of the family. So all of those nuances, which do have a name, but in the community, it wasn't mentioned. So I've used it in my doctoral research and actually my new book, which is Marianismo. That's the gender expectation for Latina women. So most people know machismo, which is expectation of the men. Yeah. And so for men, machismo is about, you're the breadwinner, you know, you're strong and you take care of your family in this manly way. And Marianismo is the expectation around being sacrificial. It comes from the Virgin Mary. The Maria is the basis for it. And it's, you know, the self-righteousness for the benefit of others, right? As you stay pure and kind-hearted, you take care of people. So you put others before yourself. So in my mother's case, I actually just dedicated my new book to her because I just don't think she ever found, I always knew she was strong. She had a voice. She would do so much for everyone. If she was driving and, you know, had to cut somebody off because they weren't nice on the road to others, she would do that. That's where I saw her as an advocate. But I never saw her find the strength to say no to her parents or the cultural expectations or any of that. And she died young. She was 27 when she died, but she never did step away from, this is what I do. And she actually used her married last name until she died, and nobody knew that my father had divorced her. So it's, again, he divorced her but didn't think he needed to tell her that. I mean, just until my grandparents filled out her paperwork for her death certificate and figured out, oh, there's actually no record. So as I look back at her life, I just realized she never had autonomy and choice, which is different for me and everything that I've worked for and all of the work that I do.
What's your degree in? What did you study?
My doctorate is in education with a focus in executive leadership.
And you are obviously, maybe not, the first college graduate in your family.
Yes, I am.
How did, coming from the background you're talking about, was it difficult to reach those heights of achievement?
Yeah, definitely difficult, but also exhilarating because I love a challenge. So I think that part I do get from my mom when I think about some of the behaviors I saw.
What drove you to pursue a PhD?
Well, I always wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer, actually. I love debate. I love a good argument. I love a good debate. Either you convince me, I convince you. We meet somewhere. May not even be the middle. Or we leave believing what we came believing. But at least exposure to someone else's views helps you grow. So I always wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. But I couldn't afford, at the time, I did take the exam and I did well. But I couldn't afford not to work. So the commitment was that in your first year, you couldn't work. And I've always had to work and attend school at the same time. So I couldn't do that. So I stayed in school, and my undergrad focus was social work. And I loved people, and I loved learning. And so I stayed in school and pursued a master's in organizational communication. Just the notion of how can I understand the dynamics of positions, of relationships, of being able to connect with others, even people I don't click with, right? But how can I be able to work with them, even if I don't personally like them or they don't sit right? And then stayed and pursued a certificate, and that focus was corporate communications. And then I realized that there was this other path that I could pursue, and it was the doctoral journey. I didn't love research. I thought it was boring. But I realized that I could produce something that would document, in part, my own experience, but also that of others, and give a voice. And the reason that, going back to your like that overarching question, your question about the educational journey, when I was in school, nothing else interrupted me. It was the only time that I was alone. So I had to translate for my grandparents. I had to give my grandmother her insulin shots and check her blood sugars, and help people with anything. I mean, I was a kid, but I was an adult. And when I was in school, I didn't have to do any of that. It was just me. So I never missed school. I could not be feeling well. My grandmother would say, this one goes to school with a headache, with a stomach ache, because that was my space. And it still is. Even if I'm in a webinar, I just turn everything off. And that's my time.
Are your grandparents still alive?
No.
What generation are you from Puerto Rico, right?
Well, so on my father's side, first. On my mother's side, second. So my mother was also New Yorican.
Okay.
So my grandparents on all four sides were born in Puerto Rico.
Gotcha.
My mother was born in New York. My father was born in Puerto Rico.
Tell us about what happened after grad school. What did you do for a living?
So like I said, I've always worked and gone to school. So I was actively engaged in my community in high school. And my summer after high school, between high school and college, I was able to work for the New York City Council with my local council member and start learning the ropes, because I loved government and politics and law and, the interconnections of those systems. And then when I went to college, I worked on campus. As soon as I completed my bachelor's degree, I went to work for government and pursued my master's while I worked for the New York State Senate in Queens and then in the Bronx. And I worked with constituents, so I had an opportunity to advocate for people. And I remember things like calling a storage company once because they were charging somebody unfairly, and the person didn't speak English, and they didn't have a lot of money, and they were confused about what was going on. I remember calling them, and it's so long ago, but I remember the conversation because I felt like I was able to use something powerful, which was my elected official's name, to defend somebody else, right? To say to this person, you're being unfair, and somebody's going to hold you accountable, and you don't get to do that to this person, not on my watch. And that was definitely a life-changing experience for me. It started with being on the city council floor at 18 years old with my councilman, with an ID with my photo that said councilmanic aide, and that access that he gave me. But then, being able to translate that to, okay, what do I do with this knowledge and to an extent power, because it wasn't my name, but if I used the name, people were like, oh, okay, all right, we're going to figure it out, because they didn't want problems with the elected officials. And I learned very clearly that if you have a title, you should be using it to help people. And I was able to connect that to my grandmother going into my local assembly member's office needing some advocacy support, and again, me always having to translate and be the adult and be the liaison for access to services and information. And being able to do that for work was great. So I worked for the city council, I worked for the state senate, I worked for the state assembly. And as I accessed further formal education, really solidified my reputation as a leader in my community, but then also throughout New York City, throughout New York State. And that was another adjustment coming here, because I didn't know anybody here in office, in positions, and had to really start from scratch. And so now that I've held, positions, elected office, appointed office, board service, just so many different spaces that I've been able to lead in. And now I get calls from so many directions in our community. It feels like a 360. Okay, this is how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to gain this knowledge, practice and implement to really fine tune how can I be the best advocate, and then put it to work. And so even with a national profile now, I'm still doing that. I'm still fine tuning some of those relationships. Sometimes I get calls and I'm like, okay, I have to sit on that for a second, because I was calling people the way people are calling me. And so it's a testament to the work and the dedication and the formality, right, of being one of less than 1% of Latinas in the country with a doctorate. It used to be one of less than 3% as a loose number, because we couldn't find the clear data. But there was a recent report that was published because of the rapid growth in the Latino community. Although there are more Latinas accessing formal education and PhDs, the number is shrinking. So it's still less than 1%, because there are so many more. So the numbers still don't look as great as we would love.
So you get your degree, you're working in the city and visiting the Poconos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was my getaway.
What was your last job before you left New York, and did you keep that job when you moved here?
I did. So I actually have always been paid for work outside of the Poconos up until 2 years ago, when I launched my own consulting firm and actually secured several local clients, along with statewide and national clients. But I'd always kept my job. So I commuted the first couple of years. My husband and I commuted together.
5 days a week?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the weekends, we were the hangout. So we would get home Friday evening, and people would start arriving, and they would leave on
People
Sunday.
From New York.
Mm-hmm. And because we're in a community also that has lots of amenities. Yeah. And so we have indoor pools and outdoor pools, and indoor and outdoor hot tubs, and indoor and outdoor tennis, and indoor and outdoor basketball, and a lake, and boating, and all of these things that you don't have in New York City. And so we would host all weekend, and people would leave on Sunday evening.
When did you get some rest?
Well, that's a good question for my whole life. I'd never rest as much as I need to. It's a staple which I've been working to undo in recent years, because it's catching up to me. But I remember every night when I got home from work, I would clean something up. And by the time I was
were you
ready,
getting home at night?
we would get home around 6:30, which wasn't as late as other people, because we would leave earlier, and we both had some flexibility because we had been in our jobs for a couple years, and we did speak to our supervisors about moving and kind of set some of that up before. But he worked in the Bronx and I worked on Wall Street, so we would commute together, and then we would separate when we got into the city. We tried different things. We were taking the bus. We did the local bus. We did marts. We drove, depended on what was going on with the day. But I would clean something every day, kind of organize, and by the time I was done, they would come back. And I remember at some point I was like, all right, enough with the parties. Like, we really need to live here. This is not. And then nobody wanted to go to camp anymore. To the point that my aunt and uncle sold their trailer after all those years. And then they would stay over at the house with us. And, they still do when they come. But it just changed the dynamics for the whole family. It was like, oh, now we're here. And they would come while we were building. They would visit, to watch everything and the process unfold. So that's the other thing that, is cultural, the communal experience, which I know weighed into me not wanting to be out in the middle of nowhere alone, or what felt like alone, even though it feels like independence and, a sense of freedom to be out in the open. But I was like, yeah, I can have freedom without being lonely or all the way out there without other people.
So let me ask you this. You grew up in a Latino community.
Mm-hmm.
You grew up in maybe the most diverse society on the planet, right?
Yeah.
New York City.
Yeah.
And you come out here to the Poconos. Did you experience discrimination, or did you pretty much stay away from other people and just hung out with your community? Or
That's an interesting dynamic that I've watched unfold quite a bit since I've been here. So not only did I grow up in the most diverse area, but the Senate district that I worked in Queens was the most diverse district in all of New York City. So on the 1 block radius, you could get food from over a dozen countries. So on Thursdays, we would get Italian because the Italian restaurant cooked this amazing pork loin that we loved. And on Wednesdays, we would get the Dominican restaurant because they had a really good beef soup. And so I worked with a senator who had he had timed out in the New York City Council, and we were establishing his district office in the Senate in Queens. And it was so amazing to be in that community. And coming here was definitely a culture shock. And when I grew up, there were people on the street playing dominoes and listening to salsa. And, you would walk down the street and you could smell the Spanish food. And you couldn't easily access that here. So it was a culture shock. I didn't feel it as much at first because we were commuting and we were getting home late. And we had family coming over every weekend. It wasn't until we started going into the community that we realized it was going to be an adjustment. And so we were lucky enough, as I mentioned, that the leadership in our specific office, in our community was open, but there were experiences that we had, from comments that were made to an experience when we were building with someone that owned the property next door to us, she was pulling out our stakes from the ground. And every time they had to come in and put new ones, we would get charged $250 because she was trying to sell the property next door.
Explain that. I'm sorry, you're pulling out stakes.
So, they mark your property with stakes when you're building a house.
Okay.
And that tells them, the lines. And the neighbor would buy properties, flip them, and sell them. And so she was trying to sell the property next to ours that she bought as though it was a whole property. So she would remove the stakes for her pictures and for visits. And we kept getting a call from the building saying, your stakes keep getting removed. And so we came and visited and stayed overnight and figured out she was doing it, and it was costing us money. And so one of the days she came over, my husband and my uncle were on the property, and I was the one that had been front facing, and she didn't realize my husband was the owner. So she's like, oh, are you interested in this property? Look how big it is, this whole spiel. And he's like, no, I'm not interested in this property because I already own this property. This is my property, and I need you to stop touching my stakes because you're costing me money. And we're going to press charges against you because this is private property, and we're not going to be nice about it anymore. We thought, she walked onto your property. It should be okay to say that. We left. Didn't think anything of it. Went back to New York. The next day, we got a call from the state police saying that there was an allegation that my husband pulled a gun on her. And my husband had never held a gun. Now we are gun owners, legal gun owners, because he ended up needing a gun for his job when he finally transferred his job out here. But I remember the conversation with the state trooper where we went back and forth. I explained what happened. I said, we have, complained in the office. They have signed complaints. And I remember asking him, why do you believe that's true? We don't live in PA, so there's not an assumption that you're, that you have a gun for protection or anything, right? Why does it? Because he was very adamant about, well, she said, and I'm like, but why do you believe that? It's she said versus she said. And I remember feeling like something wasn't right. In that case, I don't think it was on his part, at least, because he wasn't seeing us physically. I don't think it was racial or ethnic, but I think that was more about, well, you're coming from New York City, because there was some of that stigma too. So some of the experiences with comments and, discrimination were around race and ethnicity, particularly language. The comments of like, speak English. Well, I speak both, and I'm not going to stop speaking Spanish. And if you want to learn it, I'd be happy to teach you. But in 2016, the Pennsylvania State Legislature introduced a bill that was focused on speaking English only in public spaces in Pennsylvania. And that's not that long ago. I actually ran for state representative that year and became the first Hispanic to make a state ballot in Monroe and Pike counties. And it was only 8 years ago. And that was on the table in a place that is pretty diverse now. I mean, we have almost 1.2 million Latinos in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So it's been interesting, but there have been some stigmas more around, you're from the city, you must, and comments that people make. They come here and dirty our area, they cause chaos. Sometimes you hear people say things and you have to remind them, I grew up in the city. The one thing I think that was easier, and you asked about this earlier, the public schools. So yes, my experience was in public schools, and we have our boys in public school. And one option is always private school, because there are, a couple of popular private schools in our area, but we've always wanted them to have that public school experience in an effort to recreate some of our upbringing, because it's been so different for them. Like, they grew up here. They were born here, they grew up here, they're here. But, well, actually, let me fix that. They were actually born in New York because my doctor was in New York. That was another area of discrimination, because I had to go there to deliver, but we were here, and I could not.
Wait, you're calling it discrimination because you had to go to New York?
No, I'm going to tell you why. Because when we came back, I couldn't find a pediatric office to take us. So he said, well, where were they born? I said, New York. Oh, well, you should go to your doctor in New York. And I was like, but we live here. Well, then why did you have them in New York? I said, well, my doctor was in New York. He's been my doctor for over a decade. And I had some health issues that my doctor was familiar with. And I was also at the time working on my doctorate and taking some satellite classes in New York. It was New York. So I had to get a friend to find out from a colleague of hers, because her kids were grown, to find out from a colleague of hers where she took her little ones. And then she referred us to the pediatrician that we've been with since the boys were 3 weeks old. But we couldn't get an appointment on our own, because they would ask where they were born. And they would say, well, you should take them to New York. I gave birth in New York for specific reasons, but we live here. That was interesting.
Have your sons experienced any problem? What percentage of the population at their school is Latino?
So countywide, because it's an interesting dynamic. So countywide, Pike County, where we actually reside, is about 9% Latino right now. And Monroe County is 15-ish%. And of course, those are loose numbers, because The last census is not the most reliable, as you know. But when it comes to the schools in both counties, particularly the East Stroudsburg Area School District, which is on the very end of Pike County, so the Bushkill area, there's a campus there, an elementary school, middle school, and high school. The rest of the district is Monroe County through East Stroudsburg, is almost 2/3 students of color and about 30% Hispanic. And that's Hispanic only. Mixed race, there's another group of students. We don't see that in the administration or the teachers. So my sons went through their whole elementary journey without having one Hispanic teacher. One of them had an African American teacher. One of them did not. Neither of them had an Asian teacher. And then once we got to the middle school, they had an Asian teacher 2 out of the 3 years. And they had an African American teacher 2 out of the 3 years. And they had Hispanic teachers in the electives, not in the main classrooms. I was the first Hispanic elected to the East Stroudsburg Area School District School Board in November of 2019. And that was another area for I don't want to say discrimination in itself, but another area for our community to be pushed outside of its comfort zone, right? Because there's a level of inclusivity when we shop in the same stores together, we eat at the same restaurants together. There are restaurants showing up that represent your culture, so we're good. But now I'm seeing like I'm taking someone's seat, because a lot of people in positions of authority in our community are people that grew up here. Their families have lived here, and someone has always held a position, and they have streets named after their families. And then I come in and I'm not shy about what I'm demanding, because I've worked my butt off to be where I am so that I can have the voice that I have to influence the change that I know is needed from my own experience, but now from a higher level. So I'm not going to apologize, and I'm not going to ask for permission. And if I'm one of 9 elected officials, just like you are, I'm going to push for what I believe is right. So it was exhausting, because I'd have to explain, why do we have to call you doctor in public? Although it's the School Board of Education, so it makes sense to me that at an education meeting it would be norm, but I was the only one.
You're the only doctor on the school board?
Yeah. I was the only one with an education background on the school board. And so, and I chaired the Educational Programs and Resources Committee, where we allocated funding for new programs and, where resources were going to be used. And I represented our school district on the board of the Colonial Intermediate Unit 20, which represents special education for 13 school districts in the region, from Delaware Valley to the Lehigh Valley. And I was the first Hispanic, the first person of color, the first person under 50, one of 3 women and one of 4 people with a doctorate. And while I was elected, 3 out of the 4 years while I was elected, I was the only Hispanic elected in all of Pike County, and one of 4 people Hispanics elected in Monroe County. So that, you think about it, it's an opportunity to influence and to, bring about change, but that is exhausting.
Well, you're something of a trailblazer, apparently, right?
Oh, that's what they say.
Yeah. So tell us more about what you're doing. I mean, you're on the school board.
Not now. I've served a 4-year term. Yeah.
But what else? I know you've been very active. I've heard that you've been. So tell us about.
Yeah. So when I ran in 2016, I did not set out to run for state rep. That wasn't. I knew I wanted to get involved in politics at some point, but I knew it would take time. But a couple of things happened around the 2015-16 time period. One, my boys, I have twins, they're 14 now, but they were going to school, and I went to register them, and there were some issues that arose relating to messaging and communication on the school district's website and my interpretation of what that meant, and some confusion and the way that I was treated when I expressed what I thought it meant.
Is this something you can explain to us, or would you rather not?
Yeah, I can. So when I went to register the boys online, the instructions at the time were that if you were scheduling 2 or more appointments for multiple children, you needed to schedule them back-to-back increments. So 1 to 1:30, 1:30 to 2. When I looked at the time slots, there were categories A, B, C, but it didn't explain what they were. And there were no instructions that stated that it should be back-to-back time increments and under the same letter, right? So based on our schedule, my husband took off some time to come because he was still commuting. So when I had the boys, that was some of the change. I could commute it together. Then I had the boys. I started working from home. So I kept my job, but he still commuted. And then eventually my job was national and I was traveling a lot. So he moved over this way and started working locally. And I've always worked then from home. So I've been working from home for almost 15 years. And 2 years ago, I started working for myself. But we went there to register the boys, and the person that called on us got very frustrated because she explained that each letter was a station and it needed to be at the same station. I was like, well, it doesn't say that online. I followed the directions. So there were some comments, and I was asked what was my highest level of education. I am in leggings or sweatpants and Crocs, or, very low key. And I love the question because I couldn't wait for us to have that dialogue. Except, what did that question mean to someone that didn't have formal education like I had, and didn't speak English like I speak it, and didn't have citizenship status that protected them to be able to push back on that? Mm-hmm. So it led to me wanting to run for school board when I realized there's a lot of work to be done. And that was what I set my eye on. So I ran a write-in campaign that first year. That was August. The election was in November.
Just to be clear, so they're insulting you by
Yes.
asking you what...
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, she was, yeah. And so I turned the question around and I asked her, before I answer, I want to know what's your highest level of education. And I want your supervisor to come and join us in the conversation because I don't want to talk to you when I'm done. And she said she had a master's in education. I thought that was great. As a woman, I'm proud of you. And I have a doctorate in education. And I don't want to address you again because this wasn't about education levels. It was about not giving clarity in terms of direction. And I'm new to the system. With all of the experience that I have, I've never worked with this system before. I've never been in this district. My kids have never been to school. So what are we doing with people that don't have? And I still ask that question. I asked it recently as I was navigating something with the medical system. I always ask, if this is my experience, what is happening with others that don't have all that I have? And that's what motivates my work. So I ran, so it turned out that the stations were 4 cubicles right next to each other. And one of the women said, I will just switch my 1:30 with you and I'll take them from 1 to 2. And that could have been easily fixed in the first place. But those are some of the things that happen when people are not sure what to do with change. And when I went to Social Security, I kept my maiden name even after we were married because I was in New York and people knew my name. But when we were expecting the boys, my husband said, it's probably good if you take my name. You can still keep yours. He's really good about, I'm not taking away your identity or anything, but so they don't have to explain, right, their last names. And when I went to Social Security office, the woman said to me, my name was too long. I would have a problem on my taxes. And she sent me to the courthouse. So I went to the courthouse and the judge asked me why I was there. And he was very annoyed because he said, only people taking away a name come to the courthouse. You're adding a name. That's your prerogative. And so I had to go back and explain to her and ask for a supervisor and say, there are a lot of people here and more that are probably coming that use a bunch of last names. It's a cultural thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just Hispanics, but a large number of Hispanics do. So those are some of the nuances along the way of, the adjustment of change. But I did end up that year running a writing campaign for school board that I knew I wasn't going to win, but I wanted to, and I love the campaign trail. I love a challenge, but I wanted to say to people that they could and should participate in the school board process, in meetings. And people started asking questions, people in my community. And so I was able to start educating a group of people on their opportunity for civic engagement here, because there's such a big commuter culture that some people just go to work and come back, and on weekends some people work even on the weekends and commute, but they're catching up on family activities and laundry and grocery shopping. They don't fully engage. They may not even vote because they're back and forth and they don't feel connected. So that's where I first started doing some of that work. And then I connected with one of the local political offices, and there wasn't a candidate running on the Democratic ticket for state representative. And I was like, well, I don't have the name recognition, I don't have the money. I was releasing a book that I had co-authored out of Chicago called Today's Inspired Latina, which was a collection of 25 stories of Latinas across the country. And I was like, it's not a good time, but I know how to do it. I love the campaign trail. So sure, I think everybody should defend their seat. And if you get reelected, great. And if you don't, okay. And so I did launch a campaign for state representative, and that gave me an opportunity to connect with a lot of people and start building relationships and start really digging into some of the needs that I may and may not have known about. That's where I connected with the Brodhead Watershed Association, and I served as their board secretary for a year before I joined the board, just really learning about their work and understanding environmental justice. And then I started connecting with different churches and organizations that I had met when I was on the campaign trail, but really connected with what they were doing or what they were saying. And but I still had my eyes set on the school board. That's where I really wanted to be. So I ran for school board in 2019. When I ran in the primary, there were 22 candidates among the both parties. And the thing with school board in Pennsylvania, for those who don't know, is that you can cross-file. So there were 22 candidates on the ballot. That was interesting in itself. And so when I came on, we had an all-white school board, predominantly male, which is true not just across the Commonwealth, but across the country. It's generally men, older white men, that are on the school board. And when I came in, 3 women were coming in as new members. Myself, an African-American woman who was the 4th African-American, and a Jewish woman. And so then we had a majority female school board, still majority white, but female. So there was some shifts. In 2022, the Pennsylvania School Board Association released a report. They had done some research on demographics of school board directors across the Commonwealth, and they had shared that 3% of school board directors across the Commonwealth were Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, men or women. So out of 4,500, there were 136, and I was one of them.
And you chose not to run again, or you ran?
I ran again. I did not get reelected. I actually wanted to run for a 2-year term. I had to run for a 4-year term because there wasn't a 2-year term up at the time. That's another conversation. But there were several contentious races, and more so in Monroe County, that impacted the school board race and in 2023, as well as I am pro-union, but I will not allow anybody to tell me how I'm supposed to vote, what I'm supposed to do, what I'm supposed to say, because I work for and represent the people. So I pissed off the union, and they didn't endorse me. They endorsed me in my first election, but they didn't endorse me for re-election, and they worked actively against me to ensure that I didn't get reelected. And what we had then was so this re-election cycle, there were 11 candidates on the ballot from both parties. I was still the only Hispanic, and there was one African American. He had been elected when I was in my going into my third year, so 2 years in, and he also did not get reelected or get endorsed. And I know politics, it doesn't faze me. I don't need a title to do the work. Everything I'm saying here, I've said it to them. I've said it in public meetings. It's on the record. But when you receive an email, I received an email from their endorsement committee that said, we had lots of great candidates and unfortunately couldn't endorse everyone. We could only endorse 5. We had to endorse the most qualified candidates. And they endorsed a 19-year-old East Stroudsburg University student who lives at home with his parents, who's never worked, whose brother is an elected township supervisor and works for one of our state representatives. Family members work in the district, and he's white. And I get along with the family, and they supported me. That's not the point. It's in principle. So I did write back and say, you can BS other people, but you will not do it to me. You play politics all you want, but I am the most qualified candidate, from the formal education to being a 4-year incumbent, to the work that I do on the local, state, and national levels, to the committees that I've successfully chaired over the last 4 years, to the fact that I'm Hispanic and it's not a race card. I represent more than a quarter of the students who don't have a voice if I'm not at the table. And ideally, I built allyship with people that could think about the issues, but it's not the same as being able to say I lived it. That's why I understand it. So that dynamic played out very interestingly, which is fine. That it gave me a chance to finish my book that I had not finished because I was working so many hours on the school board. And like I said to them, I'm more dangerous off the school board than I am on the school board because I don't have the holds, of the things I cannot say. So that was the journey. But I still do work. And so what we saw was a husband and a wife get elected at the same time. So they have now 0.25% of all school board votes. The husband became again, nothing personal. And this is all thing I've said publicly. It's not personal, it's principle. And he became the president as soon as he stepped on the board. And he had retired as a principal from our district 2 years before that. And his wife was the immediate past president of the union. And the president now was her vice president. And as soon as they came, they gave a very unique and enticing contract to the teachers, which is great. I'm not opposed to that. The issue is, can the community afford it? Is it sustainable? And where's the fiscal responsibility? Then they got rid of the superintendent that we had just given a new contract to. And all the things they said they weren't happy about, they magnified a bunch of times when they just hired their best friend who they vacation with and gave her a 5-year contract instead of the 3 years they gave every other superintendent, and gave her just $10,000 more than we had given him, and he had been here 8 years. And then they get pissed off when I go to school board meetings and say things like that and go on the record. But so that's the political dynamic. And I've been told to shut up, and I've had big men slam their hands on the table and yell at me and try to intimidate me, and I've been called into meetings with the union once. I just said this at a public meeting a couple months ago. I said I told you that they wanted to get rid of the superintendent because they asked me to support it when I first came on. They called me to a meeting, and they were 8 middle-aged white men lined up, all with the same background and like almost every sense of the word. And they asked if I would, and I said no, unless there's a case that is beneficial for students to get rid of someone, I'm not okay with that. But if I were to support it, who would you want? And the name that they gave is the person who's now the board president. So when I said that at a public meeting and the Pocono Record put comments in the paper, then I'm the one that's the problem. But
What else are you involved in? You mentioned the Brodhead Watershed. What else are you involved in?
So I served on Governor Tom Wolf's Latino Commission, statewide Latino Commission, for 6 years. I was appointed to represent the Poconos, and I chaired the commission's statewide education committee for 3 out of those 6 years, which gave me an opportunity to, one, bring statewide leaders here. So I've brought the Secretary of Education, the Executive Deputy Secretary of Education, the Secretary for the Aging, the Chief Diversity Officer for the Commonwealth, just statewide leaders from big cities like Philadelphia and Lancaster and Reading, and people that only would come here to get away and relax for the weekend, right? And they come here, and I always say, I put you to work. And so I was able to host several meetings. The last commission meeting, which was in December of Governor Wolf's administration closing out, we held it at East Stroudsburg University in a big partnership event with the Pocono Mountains Visitors Bureau and lots of organizations, as a testament to the community that we deserve the resources and the attention that all of the cities get, because our people have needs too. So I always do the work to bring resources. During the pandemic, I helped our district secure a $75,000 grant to feed the elderly. So when the buses would go to the bus stops to bring meals, they were able to bring extra meals for the elderly. And I did that in partnership with then Secretary Robert Torres, Secretary for Aging, who also translated, or his office had materials translated, because at the time, the research showed that the fastest growing community of elderly was in Monroe County, and it was led by the Hispanic community. So we did a lot of work. We did some work in Pike County as well. And then I am on the board of the ACLU of Pennsylvania, which we don't have a chapter of here locally. So there's Lehigh Valley, there's Pittsburgh, there's Philadelphia. I'm an at-large member, and my role, if you will, is to gain visibility so that people know the ACLU works in this area, even though there's not a formal chapter, but then also build capacity. So when people call me about different issues, even yesterday I was having a conversation, I'll say, well, this is the work that the ACLU does. So I will put on the ACLU hat. I'm appointed to the Monroe County Children and Youth Advisory Board, appointed by the Monroe County Commissioners, and I chair the education committee there. And having been raised by my grandparents and, being adopted by them down the line and knowing that experience, it's a full circle moment to be able to support. So yesterday I dropped off 24 donuts at the office because we wanted to make sure that our board supports the staff. So during holidays and end of summer, certain times of year, we drop off snacks and, just say, like, you matter. Because there are times when our young people don't have a place to go. And I can't take someone in my house because my life is crazy. No, I say it's fulfilled, right? My husband, my sons, we have a groove in the craziness. So I can't bring someone else into the fold. It's not fair, especially somebody with an unstable life already. But I can help in these other ways, right? And I work very closely with the Pocono Mountains Visitors Bureau, leading their diversity, equity, and inclusion work and helping them connect with the community. So I'm able to then connect some of the community work to some of the business work, some of the government work, because we have the attention right now of the Shapiro administration around tourism dollars and economic development. So it allows me to connect the dots. And that brings resources. So I do also work with the universities a lot. I've done significant work over the past 2 years around civic engagement with East Stroudsburg University, Moravian University, Cedar Crest College, and I'm working on something with Northampton Community College because I'm the senior content advisor for the Pennsylvania Latino Convention, which we had the 7th one this year. It happens every year in a different city in Pennsylvania during Hispanic Heritage Month, where 600 plus people come together from different backgrounds, sectors, race, ethnicity, age, location, to talk about the issues that are impacting Latinos in Pennsylvania and how do we partner to do better, and how do we apply that to other populations and vice versa. And then I also sit on the diversity committee for the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission to ensure that people know about work opportunities in a place that they may not look at right away. It's not the first place to think about applying for a job. And I served on the Pennsylvania Department of Education's Equity Task Force, where I chaired the subcommittee on advocacy during the pandemic. And that focus was around providing guidance, resources, and language for administrators and school board directors around how do you navigate the politics that were showing up in school board meetings and online around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because the terminology has become so political that the importance of the work and the need for the work has been pushed in the shadows, if you will. So I had the opportunity to help with creating resources around terminology and language, and then also at the time was leading an effort to push for executive order before Governor Wolf left office. It didn't happen, but we were able to influence some of the mandatory training for PDE staff, teachers, etc., that became mandated for them to participate in cultural competency training online. So they needed 8 hours. Unfortunately, it was just rolled back in a ruling just about 2 weeks ago in a court case where a conservative organization had been fighting PDE in court around some of those DEI benchmarks. Again, from a political standpoint, people don't understand. When you talk about diversity, oftentimes the mind goes to race, ethnicity, skin color, things that I can wrap my mind around. But there's family dynamics, like my family growing up, or a foster family, an adopted family. There is geographic diversity. The fact that my sons live in Pike County and there's no Pike County Technical Institute, so they have to commute to Monroe County Technical Institute, and it's a 40-minute drive, and it takes 2 hours on a school bus because it's making 26 stops. And some kids don't get to eat breakfast at home, and if they get to school late because the bus took so long, they don't get to eat at all, and they miss homeroom and they get to first period late. But that's not a public conversation. People are fighting DEI, but we're not talking about what it means and why we need to think about it. So we have kids that are being asked how much is 2 + 2, but they don't have a coat in the winter.
DEI for the camera is?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay. So you've lived here for 18 years, and you've seen the Latino community grow, I assume.
Yes.
Are you happy that you moved to the Poconos? Or another way to ask the question, would you encourage other people you know in the city to move, other Latinos to move to the Poconos? Or isn't it so much, do you group yourself as a Latino or Latino or as a New Yorker?
I have a t-shirt, I should have put that one on today, that says, "A New York girl in a Pennsylvania world," that my cousin made for me. We saw the design somewhere and he made one for me. So I always feel connected to New York. You know, my sister is a sergeant in the New York Police Department there. My other sister is a licensed clinical social worker who works for Child Protective Services in New York. You know, I have lots of family there. I go there for events. I don't go there as much as I used to. So even up till, say, maybe the pandemic, I was going once a month. And now I don't go for months. And so I definitely identify as at home in Pennsylvania. And I think part of it is having established now a life here, raising my kids here. They definitely are at home here. We talk about, if we were to move, where would we move? And they're like, oh, not from here. We're not. We like to hear them think out loud. And when we talk about going to college, and like, well, if I do go away to college, so I'm going to be coming home a lot. And, they love it here. I think the work that I do across the state, and so when I'm in Philadelphia, I'm at home. I know so many people there. When I'm in Reading, I'm at home. And Lancaster, I know all the restaurants and the people, and all of those areas have pockets where they're highly Latino populated. So there is a sense of not just the broad community, but community. So a couple of things. Last week I was at an event. It was a women's year-end holiday cookie gathering. And we were talking about some issues that women face. And someone said, I want us to think about how much harder this is for women of color. And it clicked for me. Now, this is my work. I do that every day. I'm often the one reminding people about my experience and, the experience of people who identify like I do. But it wasn't me in that moment. And for a second, I looked around the room and realized I was the only woman of color. Now, I'm white presenting, and generally, I've been too busy to get my hair touched up. Generally, I have blue hair, right? And if I don't open my mouth, and this has happened, people assume I'm from here. People that don't know me, and I open my mouth and like, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "I'm from New York," right? But so then everybody kind of looked at me, and we all started laughing because we all realized it. And I said, well, yes, we do need to think about that. And thank you for not making me do all the work all the time, right? But more importantly, thank you all for making this such a safe space that I didn't come in. And I did do that a bit. And I've had to do that in other states when I go away for work, just kind of assess the room to figure out where do I fit in, right? I'm often the only one. I'm often the first one. But I was sitting there all night, hanging out, eating cookies, talking, and it wasn't the first thing. So experiences like that solidify that this is my community, right? Because I didn't notice. That was different. Mm-hmm. We do have celebrations here. So the Pocono Latin Fest, which happens every year, I always help organize that and make sure that we have a good time, because that's the one celebration a year that is focused on all things Latino, but not exclusive. Other people can come and say, I want to bring, Southern food, or I want to do an Irish dance. Great, because it's still inclusive. And we started doing that at East Stroudsburg University a few years ago, which was a wonderful opportunity to give our students a sense of belonging, because some students come here from other areas that maybe have more Latinos or that are more populated. So it looks like they have a lot of Latinos versus here where we're spread out, we're commuting, we're always in cars and they can't tell. We've had the opportunity to do events where we've done a flag ceremony with different flags that represent the Latino subgroups. And we have lots of non-Latinos come and participate. And that's exciting. We have been able to work with the borough to put, and ESU to put flags representing the Latino subgroups during Hispanic Heritage Month. We have the businesses and Visitors Bureau celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. We have an opportunity to hear some things in Spanish on the radio and in different places. And we have lots of restaurants that are coming up and doing things. So it's certainly changed. And I do tell people, I'm actually right now helping someone look for a place near me to come from the city because they sold the house they live in and they have to move. I'm like, you need to just come over here. My uncle bought a house about 5 years ago, half a mile away from me. My best friend moved about 10 minutes from me in my community around 7 years ago. My cousin bought a house about 15 minutes away from me 9 years ago. And so when we moved here, we didn't have anybody to leave the kids with. We were building our relationships. But now we have lots of people, not just blood family, but just lots of people. My boys have been part of scouts and karate and hockey and marching band and school play. And so everywhere we go now, it's funny, but sometimes I try not to be seen now because I'm trying to get somewhere and it takes me a long time to get around because people are asking me questions or, we're catching up. And so sometimes I'll wear a hat and, kind of like I have to go. And this one day I did that. I had a hat and my sunglasses on because I was like, I really have to go. And I went into ShopRite and it's always full. So I'm definitely going to see somebody I know. And my aunt called me on the phone and I answered the phone with my earbuds in. And next thing you know, somebody was tapping me on the shoulder that recognized my voice.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, I had something I needed to ask you. So now I don't have to message you about it. And I was like, okay, well, I worked to be in the community, right? So I'm there. So I guess I'll enjoy it now.
I'm not sure how you do it. You say very busy.
I told you I don't sleep much. I wasn't kidding about that.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. And you're young. I mean,
how old do you think? Oh, I told you already. Shoot, I should have asked you before.
Cat's out of the bag.
I know.
So let me. What should I have asked you about? Is there something that I should have asked you about?
No, I think all of that is good because it's probably not going to come up with other people. So I think all of that is good. Did you talk to Adria and Christina already, or you will?
No, not yet.
Okay, so it'll be different with each of them. So what we talked about are nuances that probably won't come up that way. Things like when I was on Governor Wolf's commission, I was able to give proclamations to local organizations. Actually, we had an event at the mansion that I was able to bring a proclamation for, and had Governor Wolf give awards to local people. So Tony got an award. It was a Lifetime Achievement Award. And Christina got an award. So you may want to ask her about that. It was the first time, it's been the only time that someone's received an award for communications from the governor's office. And it was around the coverage that we worked on during the pandemic. And so I pushed for it and pushed for it. And that's what I do. I always say to them, I'm not going to ask for mileage reimbursement. I'm not going to ask for anything, but when I call you for my community, you better come through. And they do. They do. So I think the conversations with Christina and Adria will be different enough that some of what I talked about can fill in a broader picture.
Well, I have one final question.
Okay.
Besides your family, which everybody says when I ask this question, their family, what are you most proud of in your life? What achievement are you most proud of?
Definitely the relationships that I've been able to build. I was just saying this to the person I was coaching earlier. And I guess it still is connected to family in some way, but I've built the kind of network at the national level and I'm starting to penetrate some global sectors with people using my work that allow me to reach out to people and make things happen. And it's amazing, but it's also humbling. For what I said before, I would call people for things like this, right? And I would hope, there were many times that I would hope that somebody would take my call or that somebody would give me 2 minutes, not even to talk about my problem, but to tell them about somebody that really needed them and needed help, because I saw my grandparents so many times asking for help or needing help and not getting it. And so those relationships are, I get calls from national organizations, national leaders, national elected officials, and the reputation that I have is that I get things done. It's a twofold, right? For people, like some of those that I mentioned, they don't like that because they know that if I'm not on their side, it's going to be a problem. And then, but for others, they know. And I always say when I show up to contribute. So if I tell you that I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it in the same way everybody else does, but I'm going to do it. And I'm really proud of that. That if I call someone and say I need this, they make it happen. And it's so crazy that I go to different states somebody asked me about it the other day, like, isn't it nice to get away where you're not recognized? And I was like, yeah, but that's not the case. So I was vacationing in Ocean City, Maryland last summer. Actually, we went there for the week so I could finish my book because it had been dragging out. And I was on the boardwalk and somebody called my name. And it was Brandon Hanks, who is the owner of Rebel Stages here in our community. Happened to be on vacation the same day. I was in a board meeting with my earbuds, and somebody stood in front of me and went, and it was Molly Moore and her family from the Visitors Bureau. We're on the same. Okay, that's a commonplace. During Thanksgiving, I was in Orlando, and I went Black Friday shopping at the outlets with a friend from high school and her sister-in-law. And I bumped into Luis Miranda, who's a mentor and a friend. He's Lin-Manuel Miranda's dad, and I know him from New York from the political space. I was actually texting with him this morning. And he was there with his grandsons. So we took a selfie, and we're like, what a small world. I mean, I was in Chicago sitting aside checking my email. I was there for an event, and somebody came over and said, Dr. Bonilla. It was somebody that read my dissertations. And it happens all the time. I went to Hawaii to present, and a young lady came over and said, I'm only here to meet you because I read your work. So everywhere I go, it happens. And it's amazing, but it is also humbling, because to me that means that I have more responsibility to maintain that integrity and to do what I say I'm going to do. And that's tough in politics. So I would say definitely the relationships is the part of my work that I'm most proud of, because it feeds into everything else.
That's a good note to end on. I want to thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Okay.